Are you ready for a story you'll be talking about for weeks? Don't let your coffee get cold, because the drama is just getting heated. Trust me. Once you dive in, you won't believe how one insufferably nosy HOA busybody turned a peaceful day on my family farm upside down. Let's jump right into how Karen dialed 911 on my property, blissfully unaware that the police were already on site waiting for her. I live on a 40-acre farm that has been in my family for generations. My parents settled here in the early 1960s, long before HOAs dictated how short your grass needed to be or what color you were allowed to paint your house. Back then, no one cared if your rooster crowed at dawn, or if your goat gave birth right in the middle of your front yard. But times changed, and farmland in the area slowly vanished, replaced by identical homes with perfectly trimmed hedges and ironclad HOA rules. The latest addition to our once rural community was a pristine, soulless subdivision, where everything from the color of your shutters to the breed of your dog had to be HOA approved. Enter Karen, the self-appointed queen of rule enforcement. Karen didn't just love the HOA. She worshipped it like a religion. She treated the bylaws as if they were sacred texts, enforcing them on every unfortunate soul who crossed her path. And though my farm was not part of the HOA, that minor detail didn't stop her from trying to control it. Every morning, Karen stood by her perfectly manicured hedge, arms crossed, watching me like a predator studying its prey. If I so much as painted my barn or installed a new fence post, she scribbled furiously in her little notebook, muttering about violations. It was as if she was personally offended by my farm's existence. Over time, her nitpicking became a constant irritation. First a drip, then a flood. She complained about my goats being too loud, my rooster crowing too early, and the horrific smell of my compost heap. Never mind that farms naturally smell like farms. Karen acted as if she was inhaling toxic waste every time the wind changed direction. Her greatest obsession, however, was my old barn. My grandfather had painted it a deep harvest gold back in the 1970s, and though it had faded over time, it was a piece of our family's history. But Karen loathed it. That color is an abomination. It lowers property values, she shrieked one morning, waving a pamphlet of approved HOA colors in my face. I laughed and told her she had no say in my barn's color. That only fueled her vendetta. Her campaign against my farm intensified. She tried to get the HOA board involved, but they had no authority over my land. So she took matters into her own hands, filing complaint after complaint to every county office that would listen. Noise complaints, zoning complaints, even animal cruelty complaints, despite the fact that my animals were probably happier than she'd ever been in her life. But none of them stuck. I was legally in the clear. Still, that didn't stop her. If she couldn't get me through official channels, she would make my life miserable in other ways. One day, she confronted me at the property line, her face twisted with determination. If you don't start following HOA guidelines, I will escalate this to the proper authorities. I smirked. You mean the authorities who already told you my farm is none of your business? She stormed off, heels clicking like a judge's gavel. But I knew she wasn't done. Karen never backed down. The next day, she was pacing at the boundary again, furiously scribbling in her notebook. Something told me this time she had a new plan, a bigger one, and I was right. That night, she made her move. At exactly 6:45 a.m., I saw her SUV tearing out of her driveway like a woman possessed. The next thing I knew, she was sprinting toward my land, phone clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her voice rising into the morning air. I'm calling 911. At first, I thought she was bluffing, until I heard the dispatcher's voice echo from her phone. My stomach dropped. What was she telling them? I barely had time to process what was happening before she shouted my address into the phone. There's illegal dumping happening on my neighbor's property. It's an environmental hazard. You need to send someone immediately. My heart pounded. Was this really happening? Was Karen actually trying to get the cops involved over a compost pile? But before I could say a word, a slow grin spread across my face. Because what Karen didn't know was that the cops were already on my property. And they weren't here for me. Karen stood at the edge of my property, still clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her face twisted in triumphant self-righteousness as she barked out my address to the 911 dispatcher. I could hear every word as she dramatically exaggerated her accusations. Yes, it's illegal dumping. It's toxic waste. He has mountains of rotting garbage piled up on his farm, and the smell is unbearable. There are animal carcasses in the compost. He's polluting the entire neighborhood. My jaw nearly hit the ground. Carcasses? Toxic waste? What in the world was this woman talking about? I wanted to laugh, but I also wanted to scream. My farm was meticulously maintained, and my composting system was completely eco-friendly. But Karen wasn't just exaggerating. She was straight up fabricating crimes out of thin air. She wanted me gone, and if she had to lie her way there, she would. But here's where things took a hilarious turn. As Karen continued her tirade, demanding the police shut down this operation, she was completely oblivious to the fact that law enforcement was already on my land, and they weren't here for me. Just 10 minutes earlier, Deputy Reynolds had arrived to take water samples from the creek that ran along the back of my property. See, Karen had been so focused on my compost heap that she never noticed her own HOA had a serious problem brewing right under their noses. Over the past few months, my farm's water supply had been mysteriously contaminated. I'd noticed a weird film on the water, a chemical-like odor, and even some of my crops near the creek had started wilting for no reason. At first, I thought it was just a fluke, a bad batch of fertilizer or something, but then I heard whispers from other farmers up the road. Their water had changed too. Something was getting into the creek, and whatever it was toxic. So, I did what any responsible landowner would do. I called the Department of Environmental Conservation. They sent out specialists who ran preliminary tests, and what they found was shocking. The creek contained dangerously high levels of commercial-grade fertilizers, pesticides, and chemical runoff. The kind of stuff that could destroy an entire ecosystem. And guess where the contamination was coming from? Not my farm. Not even close. It was coming from the pristine, cookie-cutter lawns of the HOA neighborhood. Specifically, from their over-manicured flower beds and golf course-perfect lawns. The same flower beds that Karen obsessed over, the same ones she constantly bragged about, saying they made the neighborhood look elegant compared to my unsightly farmland. That's why Deputy Reynolds was already here. He was gathering evidence, collecting water samples, and documenting the contamination for an official county investigation. And just as Karen was screaming at the 911 dispatcher, claiming I was poisoning the neighborhood, the actual authorities were already on the verge of exposing her for doing just that. I watched as Deputy Reynolds capped another water sample, giving me a knowing glance. He had heard everything Karen had just said. He knew this was about to get interesting. Then, like a scene straight out of a bad soap opera, Karen marched across the yard, still ranting into her phone, completely unaware that her heroic call for justice was about to blow up in her face. Yes, send the sheriff's department. This man is out of control, she snapped. This isn't just a small violation. It's a major crime. She was so caught up in her dramatic performance that she didn't notice Deputy Reynolds casually strolling toward her. She turned, eyes ablaze with indignation, and froze when she saw his sheriff's badge gleaming in the sunlight. The deputy crossed his arms, cocking his head slightly. Ma'am, I couldn't help but overhear your call. You're reporting an environmental crime on this property. Karen's face went through a roller coaster of emotions. Shock, confusion, and then an impressive attempt at composure. Why, yes, officer, she huffed, straightening her blazer as if she were about to deliver the closing argument in a high-profile trial. This man is violating countless sanitation laws. The air here is practically toxic. Deputy Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Toxic air? He repeated, clearly amused. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. You wouldn't happen to have evidence to back that up, would you? Karen blinked. Well, I mean, just look at the place, she spluttered, waving a hand at my perfectly legal, fully operational farm. That compost heap alone is a biohazard. That's when a second patrol car pulled up. Out stepped Deputy Garcia, a younger officer I had met before. He had been the one to respond the last time Karen falsely reported me for vagrants trespassing on my own land. He took one look at the scene, glanced at me and sighed. "Karen?" he said, clearly exhausted by her antics. "What is it this time?" Before Karen could answer, a third vehicle arrived. But this wasn't just any squad car. This was an unmarked black sedan, the kind that detectives drive. Out stepped Detective Morris, a county investigator who specialized in environmental crimes. Karen's confidence started to crack. She instinctively took a step back. "Why are there so many of you here?" she asked, her voice suddenly less aggressive. Detective Morris ignored her and strode over to Deputy Reynolds, who handed him the sealed water sample. Morris gave it a long, measured look, then turned his gaze to Karen. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we're here investigating a serious environmental violation. Multiple complaints have been filed about illegal chemical dumping in the creek that runs behind this property." Karen's face lit up. She thought she had won. "Finally! You see!" she cried, throwing an accusing finger at me. "I told you he was contaminating the neighborhood. Now you can arrest him." Detective Morris glanced at me for a moment, then smirked. "Oh no, ma'am. You misunderstand." He tapped the water sample in his hand. "The pollution isn't coming from this farm. In fact, preliminary tests show that this land is following all environmental regulations. The real source of contamination." He took a step closer to Karen, his voice even but firm. "It's coming from your HOA's property." Karen's smug expression crumbled. "What?" she whispered. Deputy Garcia flipped open his notepad. "We have evidence showing that commercial-grade fertilizers and pesticides from the HOA's landscaping program have been running off into the creek. Several farmers have already reported contaminated water supplies. The county is launching a full investigation." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For the first time since I'd met her, she was speechless. Detective Morris nodded toward the farm. "Ma'am, you called 911 to report a crime. Congratulations. You just reported your own HOA for environmental violations." Karen made a horrible strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a dying bird's squawk. But, this isn't right," she shrieked. "He's the criminal. He's the one who—" Deputy Reynolds cut her off. "Ma'am," he said, dead serious now, "I suggest you stop talking, because from where I'm standing, you've got bigger problems than a compost heap." And just like that, Karen realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen stood frozen, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand, her mind clearly racing for an escape. The woman who had just moments ago swaggered onto my land like a righteous avenger now looked like a cornered animal. Her face had drained of color as Detective Morris, Deputy Reynolds, and Deputy Garcia all stared her down. She opened her mouth, likely to spin some kind of desperate defense, but nothing came out except a weak, breathless sound. The kind you make when the ground beneath your feet has just disappeared. I crossed my arms, watching with muted satisfaction as the reality of her situation settled in. Karen had called 911 to report a crime, and in doing so, she had unknowingly led law enforcement directly to the real criminals. Still, in true Karen fashion, she wasn't about to go down without a fight. This is ridiculous," she finally spat, her voice shaky but still dripping with entitlement. She turned toward Detective Morris, jabbing a shaking finger toward my barn. "I don't care what your tests say. This farm is a health hazard." She gestured wildly toward my compost heap, the orchard, the goat pen. Anything that might look remotely offensive to someone who had never stepped foot outside of a perfectly manicured suburb. "You're telling me that this filthy place is up to code, but our beautiful neighborhood is the one breaking the law? That's absurd." Detective Morris remained completely unfazed. If anything, he looked mildly amused by her theatrics. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we have documented evidence that your HOA has been using excessive amounts of restricted fertilizers and pesticides. The runoff from your community's landscaping has directly contaminated this creek and several other properties downstream." He held up the sealed sample container. This sample will confirm what we already suspect. Karen's entire body tensed. Her breathing had become shallow, her hands clenched into fists. She turned to Deputy Garcia, desperation creeping into her voice. Why, you can't be serious. You're taking his word over mine. She glared at me with pure venom, as if I had somehow orchestrated this entire situation just to get back at her. He's the one with the animals. He's the one with the smelly, disgusting compost heap. I chuckled, unable to resist. Karen? I said, shaking my head. Do you even know what compost is? Her eye twitched. Deputy Garcia sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, composting is a legal, environmentally friendly farming practice. What's not legal is dumping chemical pollutants into a public waterway. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. It was beautiful, but just as I thought she had run out of excuses, she suddenly gasped, eyes lighting up with a last-ditch idea. I didn't approve anything, she blurted. This is all just a misunderstanding. I don't even handle landscaping decisions. You need to talk to the HOA president. He's the one in charge. A heavy silence fell, and as if the universe itself had a perfect sense of comedic timing, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the property at that exact moment. The tires screeched slightly as it came to an abrupt stop, and the driver's door swung open with urgency. Out stepped a man in a crisp polo shirt and khaki slacks, the Stonefield Meadows HOA logo embroidered neatly on his chest. He was middle-aged, his hair slicked back with precision, his eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses. He radiated corporate energy, the kind of guy who gave long-winded speeches about property values at board meetings. Karen's face lit up with relief. "George!" she gasped, practically sprinting toward him. "Thank goodness you're here. You won't believe what's happening." George Carmichael, the president of the Stonefield Meadows HOA, barely glanced at her. Instead, he locked eyes with Detective Morris and immediately looked concerned. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. "I got an urgent call from one of my board members saying law enforcement was investigating our HOA. Karen practically threw herself at him. "George, they're accusing US of environmental violations. They're saying that the HOA is responsible for polluting the creek." George's face visibly paled. He turned back to Detective Morris. Is that true?" Detective Morris flipped open his leather-bound folder and pulled out a printed invoice. He handed it to George with calm precision. "This is an official purchase order," he said. "It details a series of chemical acquisitions made for landscaping projects in your community. Orders that far exceed state regulations." He pointed to a bolded signature at the bottom. "Recognize that name?" George took the paper, read it, and went rigid. Karen, sensing his hesitation, leaned in. "George, it's all a mistake. I mean, I might have signed some things, but I didn't know." George slowly turned to her. "You signed this?" Karen froze. For the first time since this disaster had started, she looked genuinely afraid. I mean, she stammered, but she had nothing. George exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples like a man who had just realized his entire career was about to implode. Then, without another word, he turned back to Detective Morris. "The HOA will cooperate fully," he said, his voice tight. "We had no idea Karen had made these purchases. If any laws were broken, we'll take appropriate action." Karen whipped around. "George, what are you?" But he cut her off with a sharp glare. "Enough, Karen." That was it. That was the moment she realized she was well and truly screwed. Deputy Reynolds approached her, handing her a business card. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. Given the extent of the contamination, the county is considering heavy fines, possibly even legal action." Karen stumbled backward. But I was just trying to." Deputy Garcia sighed. "Ma'am, this all started because you called 911 on a farm that wasn't breaking any laws. Now you're the one under investigation. Maybe next time, you should pick your battles more wisely." Karen's lips quivered. Her knees buckled slightly. She looked around. First at me, then at the officers, then at George, who refused to even meet her gaze. Then finally she snapped. "This is a conspiracy," she screeched. I'll sue. I'll call my lawyer. Detective Morris sighed. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, we'll have to escort you in for disorderly conduct as well." Karen's mouth snapped shut. She looked at George one last time. Silent, desperate, hoping for help. But George simply turned away. And just like that, Karen had lost. As she was led toward the patrol car, I turned to Judy, who had been quietly watching from the porch. She smiled at me, then handed me a glass of lemonade. "Well," she said, sipping her drink, "that was fun." I grinned. "Sure was." The end.